Hello, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce of the Radical Center.
And I'm Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute.
Yeah, it's great to see you today, Andrew. I know we have a pretty interesting topic for today's conversation around dismantling the gender binary. So
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this and seeing where the conversation goes. And first, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Open Therapy Institute and what OTI is and does.
Yes. Well, I'm very pleased to announce that we have workshops posted now for therapists. They're accredited for continuing education credits by the APA for psychologists, by NASW for social workers, and by MBCC for counselors. So they're accredited by those three agencies for all those different degrees. We have 4 talks posted in the fall. The first one is about bias in mental health care and how to work with patients who have diverse views. The second one is about self-censorship, what causes it, how it impacts training programs, how it comes into the therapy room, and how therapists can be helpful around that issue. We have another talk on cultural issues. People are giving talks on, in that workshop, we've got 3 different talks. One of them is about humor and the mental health benefits of humor. Other talks on authoritarianism and treatment of personality disorders. And the last one is about racial reductionism in the field and how to think about race in a more nuanced way. So we've got these workshops lined up. We also have a membership where you get discounts on workshops, members-only events, and access for therapy referrals, which is for therapists. The last thing is we're also fully operational for our therapy referrals. So any patients that are interested in connecting to a therapist, these are people that we've interviewed and vetted and done a background check on, and that we have ongoing consultation with. They're very skilled people at working with diverse viewpoints, very open-minded, talented therapists. So all of those are up and running. You can contact us about all those.
And where should people find you or contact Open Therapy Institute?
Yeah, you go to opentherapyinstitute.org. There'll be a pop-up when you first come to the page. If you click on therapy, it'll take you to how to email us with information for what you're looking for in a therapist. We'll respond and pair you with someone. Or you can click on workshops. It'll take you to the workshops page, and those are listing of workshops and a way to sign up to become a member also.
I am really excited about this because it addresses 2 of the most important and pressing questions that I get over and over again, and that really were the biggest stumbling blocks to my own progress in training to become a therapist. Really, it's people ask, how can I find a therapist who's not going to be ideologically biased? How do I find someone? What do I look for? What conversations do I have? People are incredibly intimidated oftentimes to ask straightforward questions of their prospective therapist. So they're kind of hoping and crossing their fingers that they're not going to end up with someone who is, quote unquote woke and of this critical social justice ideology. And so having more directories available, having more options to connect with therapy professionals who have declared that they're not going to be ideologically biased in that way is a wonderful resource. And then the second one is students who are currently counseling students or prospective counseling students who are asking, how can I access training, or how can I get through trainings that I'm in right now that feel really ideologically oppressive? So
Yes.
how can I find a resource for that? So this is kind of addressing both of this.
So the first thing about the therapy referrals, so we really wanted to have a process that wasn't just people listing. As good as it is to have those listing services and that you can find people who maybe want to signal that they're non-ideological, you don't always know what you're getting. And sometimes there's people that post on them for weird reasons, and who knows who they are. And we really wanted to have something in place where we're really vetting people
Mhm.
and making sure that this is a really skilled therapist that we can recommend wholeheartedly, and somebody that we're working with in an ongoing way to make sure that they're good on these issues. I think it's really important that patients looking for a therapist start the therapy knowing that they can be candid about everything that they're feeling and believing. Politics might not be central. Maybe political issues aren't that central to their lives. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But you still want to be able to talk about them. And the idea that you're going to withhold that is actually something that could be pretty damaging to the treatment, because it's
Mhm.
about your life and your values and your thoughts and your feelings. And inhibiting that can actually be a big impediment to the process. So we wanted a way where people can just start off the bat knowing this is a space where you can be open, and with somebody who's skilled in this area. So that's the therapy referrals. It's pretty easy to contact us. You go to the contact page, you check that you're looking for therapy, check the box that you're looking for therapy, and you just give us a little blurb. We kind of want to know what state you're in, want to know what the issue is that you're looking to focus on, and then we'll pair you with somebody. So it's a little bit more of like a curated,
Mhm.
we learn a little bit about you and we try to find the right person for you
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm.
With the issue with whether there's students thinking about going in the field, they're already in the field, or if they're students in the field, that's really what our membership is for. I'd really encourage them to do the membership, because we're going to have members events that are all about connecting to other people in the field. We're going to have like discussions and Q&A, but also like breakout groups and ways to connect to other people. I think if you're feeling attacked for your views in the field, whether you're licensed or pre-licensed, my first piece of advice is connect to other people. Don't be alone. It's all about connecting to other people. And, maybe there's opportunities there. If you're a student, you find somebody who's got a good practice, they'd be your mentor. Maybe they'd take you on as a postdoc, or they'd take you on as a placement, or they'd give you advice. You can start to make connections with people, and opportunities can come from that. So that's really what the membership is for. And the workshops too are designed to focus on types of issues that the field is doing poorly with. And so hopefully that can give a little bit of an intellectual backing and some confidence to people who feel like their values are attacked, that actually a lot of values that are attacked are good therapeutic practice.
Mhm.
So I think both of those are really geared towards therapists. So anybody in the field who's isolated or attacked or embattled in some way, I'd say sign up for a membership and start coming to our events.
I think it's wonderful that there are more organizations like Open Therapy Institute coming forward. I think this is going to put pressure, apply some counter pressure to a lot of the things that we've been seeing in the field. So this gives me a lot of optimism seeing this, and I'm
Yeah,
very glad.
yeah, and I would also say that with the Open Therapy Institute, we really have a unique opportunity where we've got, you know, about 30 or 40 faculty members developing innovative work on overlooked issues. And we're accredited by all these bodies. And we really have the potential to grow into a big force in the field that can really be transformative. I think once patients know that they should find an open therapist, you should not see somebody that can't be open with what you believe,
Mhm.
no matter what your issue is. Once people get that, I think the demand for these services are really going to skyrocket. And I think we'll have a lot of opportunities for people. And once we start highlighting how many issues are overlooked and misaddressed in the field, there's going to be a lot of demand for research, for trainings, for other workshops. So we're really kind of putting issues on a map in a way that can really grow significantly. But what I would say is that we are a fledgling organization, and that getting involved now makes such a big difference for us in terms of growing. If you sign up for that membership, that really helps us grow and expand the services we can provide. If you sign up for the workshops now, that helps us fund more and create more trainings. If you get us on referral lists at a clinic or hospital where you are for certain patients, then that helps us expand our clinical services and bring more people in there. So I would say for all our workshops and all our events, like, share. We're going to have emails going out. Make sure you're signed up for our email mailing list, which you can do on our website on the bottom of the homepage. Make sure you're following us on social media. We're going to be posting more and more stuff. We want you to not just come to the events, but also share it, like it, retweet it, repost it, post it on LinkedIn, get it on email listservs and message boards and all of that, because we really have an opportunity to build a big organization that has staying power to really change the field.
And I know that there are a lot of people who are concerned about these issues. And so if people who have these concerns and share these concerns will get behind groups like OTI that are doing this work now, can really start to make a difference and do something concrete. So I will be sharing this as well. And thank you so much for putting this out there.
Thanks, Leslie. Yes. Yeah. And sign up. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I am really intrigued with the phrase that you mentioned, dismantling the gender binary. You have written an article around this, and I'm interested in what your take on that is. I know that's not much of a segue, but kind of jumping right in.
No, yeah. I mean, well, it just shows, I mean, it is a segue because there's so many issues that are not being addressed and that our field could be really helpful with. And I think when you get more perspectives on more issues, you see how much our field could have such an impact on society and how much work could be done that's not being done. And we really want to do all this type of stuff at the Open Therapy Institute. But so, you know, what I said to introduce this to you before we started recording was that I've written this up a bunch of different times and I can't get it published. And I think it's because the argument is just a little bit too complicated for an op-ed style article. It's a multi-step argument that it's just like, I think it's not that complicated, but it's just a little bit hard for people to follow. The first thing I would say about dismantling gender is kind of defining, as maybe your audience knows some of this, but defining the difference between gender and sex. Whereas like typically, at least in academia, they say sex is the biological aspect of being male and female, and gender is maybe the more sociocultural aspect of being male and female. So haircuts are an aspect of gender, maybe certain cuts of garments that people wear, but also mannerisms and word choice and roles and interests. And there's lots of different things that are gendered, you know, high-heeled shoes are feminine, and so is lipstick and things like that. And so all of those cultural idioms that tend to be related to being male or female, that stuff is referred to as gender. And at least for activists, maybe like particularly queer theory activists, their thinking is, well, wait, all of these idioms around gender feel arbitrary. You know, why can't a man wear a dress-like garment? You know, Scottish people wear kilts, you know, or wore kilts sometimes. So maybe that's not biological. That could change. And what, you know, why can't women, you know, play rugby or be car mechanics? And why can't men be stay-at-home parents? And so that there's these features of gender that strike people as like, well, those could change. You know, those are not biological. And I think the real radicals would say all of these features of gender could change, and they're all arbitrary. None of them really make logical sense. Why do women have to be this way, and why do men have to be this way? So they're confining, and maybe even more than that, they're unjust and oppressive to people. They kind of force people to behave a certain way or think of themselves in a certain way. And so because of this, they'd say, well, let's dismantle gender.
Mm-hmm.
Let's scramble all the gender idioms so that people don't have a sense of what male or female means in a sociocultural way.
Mm-hmm.
And so pronouns are, he, her is dislocated from biological sex. And so are, interests and hobbies and mannerisms that they're, and roles and different rituals and things like that, that they could kind of dislocate all of these from gender. And then we'll have, this is going to be some type of more equal, more liberated society. And you really see evidence of this everywhere. It's in ads and movies where the female characters are more and more masculine leads, more and more kick-ass heroes and bosses, and the men are, unless they're bad, unless they're villains, they're more maternal and weaker and more caregivers, more sensitive, and even in fashion, in fact, there's this pull towards more feminine cuts of garments and more feminine colors for men and more masculine cuts for women. So you see this all over and in ads, and it's even how characters are filmed. Whereas like, maybe in classical art, it's the common paradigm is like a male painter and like a female that's painted, and they said, well, that's oppressive, that's another arbitrary and oppressive social idiom, so let's actually have a female painter painting like a male and trying to like, and so there's subtle things about how you're looked at, and who's looking, and the different, and all of this stuff. There's really, I think, a conscious attempt by activists to pick apart all of these idioms related to gender and scramble them. And I think it's working, I guess is what I'd say, is that like maybe gender people, I'm not saying entirely it's dislocating all of this stuff from gender, but it has the power to change how people are related to sex and gender, or how they're connected to sex and gender in ways that are pretty profound. My thought on this is that basically this is a massive social experiment. And to try to dislocate every gender idiom from society, and that there's a lot of reason to believe that this could be harmful to people. Maybe they feel more at odds with their biological drives, or they feel pathologized for who they are in a different way. If they're overly traditional, that gets kind of othered and alienated. People are more conflicted about who they are and what they want, and maybe more disturbed by it. And there's reasons to think that this could contribute to mental illness, different types of sexual repression and guilt, conflict, and a greater difficulty having sustainable romantic relationships, maybe an increasing number of sexual proclivities that are not heteronormative, that kind of keep multiplying, and people maybe just being more lost and confused and alienated from sex and gender, which I think can be a pretty disturbing experience. So that was basically the punchline of the article. And I think that you do see examples of this everywhere. I was thinking in California, I think they made it illegal, if this went through, they made it illegal to separate men and boys and girls toys in the toy store
Oh,
by
wow.
sex. So they said
Illegal.
it's illegal.
Oh,
So you
wow.
have to, they cannot be segregated by sex.
Mm,
Um, and then hear about some parents, they don't want to assign a gender to their child. So they'll give the kid a gender neutral name and let the kid choose their gender at some point in childhood.
mhm.
That's a radically new way of parenting. It's not evidence-based. There's no evidence that this is going to benefit anyone. And there's reasons to think that there's risks. If kids are taught in kindergarten that gender's a spectrum
Mhm.
and they can be wherever they might be on the spectrum, um, that's a different paradigm. And it's not, I think people are often really naive about what the cost of this could be. And I'll say, so why do I think this is a difficult op-ed, like in a number of ways? Like, okay, one is I think the distinction between sex and gender is worthwhile. It's intellectually useful. A lot of people on the right don't like the distinction between sex and gender. They're like,
Mhm.
sex is biological, gender isn't a real idea. And they don't. And so I think they kind of, and I think that also on the right, there's a tendency towards evolutionary biology, evolutionary psych explanations for sex and gender, which I have a lot of respect for, by the way, and I agree with many of them.
Mhm.
But those kind of say, well, gender is innate, so nothing really around it is going to majorly change.
Mhm.
So it's actually not that scary because these attempts by the left to kind of remake gender are ultimately going to fail.
Mhm.
And so we just kind of have to weather the storm until they fail, and then we get to move back to normal.
Mhm.
But what I don't think that's true. I think that this program could have massive social costs. I think it's extremely unlikely that it's successful at creating this non-binary utopia.
Mhm.
I just don't think that's plausible. But I think in terms of really messing people up and messing relationships up and transforming even things like desire and identities in people in a really radical way, I think that's way higher of a risk than many people on the right think. Um, I think the other issue is it's which is pessimistic, is it's incredibly hard to respond to this stuff
Mhm.
because I saw a ad at a soccer game, for example, that was for Budweiser beer, and it was in like feminist pink. I don't know how else to describe it, but there's something about the female coloring the beer at this very male gendered event and space and beer and everything about it that's so male and feminizing it.
Mhm.
That stuff, it impacts the psyche. And I could kind of feel it. I think I felt it as like it had this aggressive anti-masculine sentiment to it. There's something sometimes violating about it. Like if you're going to drink a can of beer and it's got the rainbow flag on it,
Mhm.
there's something about drinking the beer with the rainbow flag that has meanings.
Mhm.
It's not just like, oh, who cares? It's just a can.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it feels ridiculous to freak out about a can or to freak out about a color. And it's true in a way that none of these individual things matter so much. It's like, okay, well, like a man can like knit, and that's not the worst. Like, I don't need to like
Mhm.
have a mental breakdown because a man is knitting.
Mhm.
But like when you take the aggregate, it does reach a critical mass where all these little things that maybe don't matter independently start to feel like an assault
Mhm.
on your gender and your worldview in a way that's very disturbing and very upsetting. So people will lash out, but they'll lash out over something that is ostensibly trivial, like a word choice or a color or something that really doesn't matter because it's not really about that one color. It's about this aggregate of thousands of attacks like this that are baked
Mhm.
into media and education in a way that started to get very disturbing and feel aggressive and violating in a particular way that's actually like potentially very damaging to relationships and mental health. Um, so it's very hard to think about how to respond to. It's almost impossible to think that this could be solved legislatively.
Mhm.
You can't ban a color for male gendered stuff. You can't force sex segregation of toys because it's like, well, wait, is a water gun's a male toy or something? Or like,
Mhm.
it's just, I don't know. You have to think about all this stuff. And so I think legislating this is probably going to be impossible. Even responding culturally is very difficult. Um, so and it's an issue, like nobody really talks about the issue quite this way. I don't know of any research on this topic. This is another thing. So it's like to actually show dismantling the gender binary does cause specific psychological harms. We won't know that until we kind of go through this massive experiment, and then 20 years later we'll have some studies maybe.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so it's a very difficult thing to think about how to research. Um, I think those are all reasons why what did make an appealing op-ed, but
Mm.
yeah.
Well, it is a tricky topic for sure, and it's hard to know where to draw lines on a lot of aspects of the topic. One of the things that when you were talking about, I love the phrase scrambling the gender idioms, because it really it's a simple and tight phrase that really describes something I feel like we
Right.
are seeing very well.
Yes.
And where does a country, where does a culture draw the line between normal variation and opportunity to explore one's personality from a bunch of different facets, like as you indicated, the idea of gender. And I've been somewhat resistant to this idea of gender as separate from sex myself, right, just in terms of its linguistic utility. I remember when we used sex and gender interchangeably.
Right.
And so it being a new concept has been something that I've been a little bit skeptical about. I feel like it's been overemphasized as something that's separate from sex, whereas masculinity and femininity, which is, I think, what we're really talking about when we're talking about gender, we're talking about, like you indicated, with the high heel shoe, or, the long hair, or the certain articles of clothing. That's not that item doesn't have a sex, but it has a sexual association or sexed association with masculinity or femininity. And expressions of masculinity and femininity are different from person to person and personality to personality. So where do we start to draw the line between what seems like a deliberate scrambling of these idioms for activist purposes, or because we've got some social fixation on sniffing them out and challenging them, versus just normal variation and a culture that's allowed, like, in the 90s and the early 2000s, where we were seeing a lot of increased acceptance of homosexuality, and a common refrain would have been something like, don't make the girl wear pink. She can choose to play with a car or a truck, and wear pants if she wants to. She can climb a tree. I mean, I remember being a kid, and I'm not that old, but when I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to climb a tree in my neighborhood because the woman who lived in that house said no girls can climb this tree. It was the best tree climbing. It was the best climbing tree in the neighborhood, and only boys were allowed to climb it.
Right.
And so then you get to like the 90s and the early 2000s, and it was girls can climb trees too, and boys can, be a ballet dancer if they want to, or whatever. So we have this normal acceptance of normal variation versus what feels like it's being pressed upon us. And so how do you even distinguish that? It's sort of elusive sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's totally elusive. I mean, there's no line. I mean, this is why one of the reasons why it's so hard to respond. And to think about, again, the legislative response around this stuff. I think if there were going to be a type of like organized legislative response to this stuff, it would be totalitarian. I mean, and I think it would ultimately be counterproductive, but it'd be like Iran. It'd be like, you will go to jail if you don't wear a headscarf type thing. I mean, which I think is totally unjust and and I also think it's counterproductive. There's something about fighting about this stuff that somehow actually enhances it.
Mhm.
If you're kind of like, I won't wear pink, I won't, it's like I don't know, it can kind of like, it still makes people, it can make it seem ridiculous to oppose these gender idioms, and it actually continues to alienate people from them. The pronouns is like a great example of something where it's like, I never thought about pronouns. I
Mhm.
just used them,
Mhm.
and it was second nature. And they've become problematized. And I guess for a therapist audience, like ego alien,
Mhm.
they're a little bit like, oh, like a pronoun is something that's distinct from being male and female
Mhm.
in terms of sex or something. Just those little, the more you kind of fixate on this stuff and talk about it or fight about it, it actually enhances the alienation from these things. And it actually works to continue to dismantle it anyway. I think it's like the Iranian thing of like forcing women to wear the headscarves and then there's a reaction against it. It probably undermines gender too in its own way, even though, I mean, that's not why, the only reason I disagree with it. But yeah, there's no clear line. And so I think this is a very difficult thing to confront in any types of organized way.
Mhm. Mhm. And when you're talking about there's sort of trivial boundary violations, like the rainbow flag on your beer was an example that you gave, where I don't
Right.
want to drink from this. I don't want to hold it. I don't want to represent this because I don't agree with this. But really, am I going to have a big fight about this? It was handed to me at a party. And if I say something about it and say, no,
Right, right.
thank you, then I've just committed a bigger statement than if I just go ahead and do it. So these little they represent small double binds that the person has put in, where they have
Yeah.
to violate themselves or they have to cause a conflict, bring the conflict out into the open.
And this could be, the rainbow beer, it wasn't meant to be, for somebody who like disagrees with gay marriage. They could agree with gay marriage. They could have nothing, but there's
Mhm.
something about having the can and drinking it themselves that's kind of incorporating being gay into you're drinking it. It's actually
Mhm.
going into your body and you're
Mhm.
holding it and you're identifying with it in a way. It's a little thing, but enough of those things, they do have meaning. And I
Mhm.
think they're pushed on people because they have meaning, not because they're trivial, but because
Mhm.
they have meaning. And there's something about the queer theory people, by the way, they seem to get that this stuff has meaning in a way that the critics don't. The emphasis on there's no difference between sex and gender, you're just a man or just a woman,
Mhm.
it's all biological. That stuff kind of gives away that we're not going to fight these little fights.
Mhm.
And like even just thinking, here's a good way to like explain. Think about a couple, the heterosexual man with a heterosexual woman.
Mhm.
Okay. But the woman works as a CEO and the
Mhm.
man stays home and cares for the baby. Okay.
Mhm.
He's still a man, right? And
Mhm.
she's still a woman, right? Nothing's changed. Okay. But let's say she's got a buzz cut. She's got a very short haircut. Maybe she's like shaved head or something. And and let's say he's got a ponytail. All right. And maybe he's got a both ears are pierced for him. She doesn't have pierced ears. Now, there's still a man and still a woman. Now, she doesn't shave her legs, okay, or her armpits, and she plays rugby and fixes up muscle cars, and maybe she man spreads when she shits and she cracks jokes, and he cooks and cleans. It's and you know maybe he even wears eyeliner. It's like,
Mhm.
so you get to this point where all of a sudden he's the woman and she's the man. And you could say even their sexual behavior, she's dominated during sex and he's submissive. And
Mhm.
you kind of get to a place where it's like this is something else.
Mhm.
But each individual step along the way is like, no, do I think that you could have a heterosexual couple and that's their kink is that she's dominant, he's submissive? It doesn't mean he's a
Mhm.
woman,
Mhm.
you know. Or there are plenty of men who have longer hair or have ponytails, doesn't make you a woman. The peer steers doesn't, staying at home doesn't. So it's like the individual stuff doesn't, but when you put it all together, you're like, and so it's a very difficult thing to resist psychologically. And I think people are being bombarded with imagery around this in what feels to me like a really deliberate and orchestrated way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're seeing it on ads, they're seeing it in movies and TV shows, they're seeing it in video games. I played a video game, that must have been 10 years ago, so it's been going on for a while, but you had to use in order to get past a certain level, you had to play with a female avatar.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like you kind of have to become virtually a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And like you had to be able to have this gender fluidity, at least in the space of the video game.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff is not accidental.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's for all the reasons you've said. I mean, it's hard to confront.
It makes me think of an abusive relationship where you are those, going back and describing them as little boundary violations they seem trivial enough that there's almost plausible deniability on the other party. Like, what? Oh, it's just it's a female character. We have male characters and female characters. It's no big deal. But
Right.
if you raise an objection to it, then it is a bigger deal. It becomes a bigger deal upon it objecting to it. And so you just tolerate and tolerate and tolerate until you have, like you said, this aggregate of the sense of your boundaries being violated or your reality being challenged to the point where you want to say something about it. But it's like a whole bunch of tiny things. So it's very hard to know where you're going to take a stand on something like that.
Well, and it's like a sign of like, oh, you're really insecure with your masculinity that you can't like wear pink or, and it's like, totally. Well, and also, can I up the controversy here? It's like, so I think one of the common findings, and this is like in lots of different traditions, I think it's part of, you could look at it from an evolutionary psych perspective or even from a religious perspective, that one of the main differences like between men and women are femininity is usually linked to a kind of like attractive and fertile or nourishing body.
Mm-hmm.
It's so embodied. Femininity is so embodied, and masculinity is so much related to status, providing and protecting, and I would say different types of power. So in religious traditions, the earth or Israel or the church or humanity is usually female because that's the embodied counterpart. And God, the disempowered and powerful force, is masculine. Women are often attracted to status and power. Men are more attracted to the body, especially the visual appearance of the body. And women's sense of their connection to their body is so merged with their identity so often, where it's like feeling fat, like the idea of feeling fat, where your self-worth is so merged with your body that they're just conflated. But how you feel about your body is about being feminine, about being sexual and being sexually attractive, about being lovable and having value and valuing yourself. And that's all tied into like physical appearance in the body. And a lot of women have enormous conflicts about it, of wanting to be looked at and not liking the way they're looked at, and not wanting that to be how they're valued, but wanting to be valued for it. And there's this huge conflicts around body issues for women, whereas power issues are so common because it's all about you want to be valued for having power, but resenting the fact that that's what people might be attracted to you for, and having, it's like what separates the men from the boys, is power, status, strength. It's about coming to age, and it's about sexuality and self-worth and being desirable and liking yourself, and it's so much related to those themes of power and status. So those variables of like the body and power are so central to the male-female polarity. I kind of even think there's something like, if you took this to an extreme, and maybe I'll lose people with this, but there's even something about displaying a male body that is feminine, where it's like, why is it feminine?
Yeah.
Why is that feminine? Because it's clearly a male body, but there's something about the body that is just somehow inherently feminine coded. And so those things of the body and female, the body and power are just so central. Well, what is the thing that gender radicals most want to dislocate about gender? It's about women and body stuff, and trying to change female standards of beauty and women's relationships body and men and power, and trying to destroy and diminish male power, and preventing men from having the status and power that they want to have to feel male and that women are attracted to. And same with the body and women. So those are the most controversial things about gender. People are still very attracted to them, but they're almost taboo or something. They're almost like very stigmatized, that this is something which is so obvious, and this dynamic is so obviously central to people's sex lives and sexual desires in such a totally obvious way. And yet we kind of like, I think, kind of BS ourselves about this a lot and pretend that this isn't happening. And it's like this central struggle of men and women in relationships and what's going on. And it's the most problematized.
Well, it's a really difficult one to talk about. It's really difficult to nail down. And so it's almost like trying to talk about religion from an academic perspective or from a scientific perspective.
Right.
It's so tricky because it's experienced really personally and slightly differently by different people. And there's all kinds of resentments around it. And I think it's really interesting how you're talking about femininity as being embodied and masculinity as being enacted, really. And there's something to that polarity that's fascinating. And one of the things that I think about when you're talking about this is I get a lot of comments on my YouTube videos about feminism, about how, well, feminism started all of this. All of this is because of the feminists, and you women are getting what you deserve now. It kind of like this comeuppance, this resentful perspective around that. And I think that that's interesting to explore. I think feminism did a lot of really important things in terms of allowing women opportunity to access the same resources and resource acquisition pathways that men have, because sometimes women need to access those without men, or want to access those without having to go through a male partner, etc. Not being less of a citizen, I think, is really important. And yet there's this what you're talking about with the woman's relationship to her body. I also wonder how we have changed that as we've become sort of a centrally marketing cultural organism. Like again, I go back to the 90s, because that's when I was a teenager, and the culture was really becoming salient to me for the first time, really. And this was the era of the supermodels. And so you had these really idealized versions of the female form being put out for everybody to consume. And they were not only idealized in that they picked the most beautiful women who really represented the cultural beauty ideals to a T, but they also airbrush and sculpt and selectively edit and selectively represent these images of these women. And so there was this feeling that I had, and that friends of mine had as a kid, of resentment towards that. And, we were all trying so hard to be skinny. We were all trying so hard to, be 105 pounds or whatever ridiculous ideals that we had, because this was our competition. The boys were looking at these images. And so I think about they were looking at whether we were projecting. Some of that was us projecting, but some of it was, like I actually came across this was how I first found Cindy Crawford. She was being shared by the boys. This is like
Oh,
the
really?
snake picture. Yeah, the nude Cindy with the snake around her. And so then you move into today where it's Instagram influencers, and it's not just Cindy Crawford and
Right.
whoever else, Kate, whoever that were the big names. So it's not just these individual icons in which feminine beauty exists, or the movie stars of the past like Marilyn Monroe or somebody, but it seems to be every other woman that you look at on social media represents some kind of absolute perfection. And then you look at yourself and think, even if you're an attractive woman, there's no way you can really be that, because that doesn't really exist. That's a figment almost. It's like a slice of imaginative femininity. Yes. And then I read like a meme post that a girl friend of mine shared some years back that was something about, I don't owe the world pretty. And it went into that. And just reading that, it was like this flood of relief. Like, I actually don't. And you realize how much you've been pressuring yourself to be something that you can't be. So I wonder about the way that way that we represent power, or the enactment of hierarchy and status for men, that makes them feel like they're never going to achieve. So they end up with this sort of nihilistic feeling. And then on the other hand, for women, these body ideals that so many will never be able to achieve, most will never be able to achieve, that makes them feel powerless and resentful. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. The model thing is interesting, because I'll speak for myself, and I know a lot of guys who feel this way, but I was never really attracted to supermodels. I always thought that it was like, they came from the fashion industry, which is so run by gay men.
Yeah.
And they would be this kind of like, they'd have this look that I just never really found attractive. And a lot of what's sold is like attractive. I don't know why. I don't know how this fits into like the gender thing, but a lot of what's sold is attractive. I don't think is attractive. Actresses, I feel like actresses have to have a certain type of prettiness. And there is a look that most actresses have, a particular look, and it's pretty, but not too sexy. And they have to be kind of like relatable, but cute enough, but not too pretty. And they can't be too sexy. And so there's this certain look that they have to have, and they kind of all fit that. And it's pretty, but it's this particular type of thing. But it's not necessarily like the most attractive women. And models have a unique look too that was, I don't know, I thought kind of strange in a way to me.
Yeah.
I always felt it was kind of strange. And I was never attracted to like real fake, heavily made up women. Like that wasn't ever. So it's interesting how what's trendy in media is distinct from what people are attracted to and what they want.
And likewise, I think that I think that there's something with this marketing culture, this heavily market-driven and advertising-driven culture that presents these sort of manifestations of what it means to be female, what it means to be attractive, what it means to be rich, what it means to be powerful. And then, just like you were pointing out in the last conversation that we had about how culture impacts our mental health, I think that these cultural archetypes really sink into people and create the projections that people have when they interact with their own identity and with other people. What they expect is expected of them. And I wonder about one of the things that I've thought is that the hyper slick marketing culture of, say, the 80s and 90s around the beauty, we saw this giant spike in plastic surgery. Cosmetic surgery is just like so many women are getting they're, trying to be young and getting their faces done, getting their bodies altered in order to be more hyper feminine, or according to the ideals of the day, the marketing ideals, really. As you point out, it's not necessarily what the individual wants. It's what the aggregate thinks it wants because of what it's being fed. But I've wondered if some of this deconstructing gender is a backlash against some of that, the hyper gender focus of this period of time. Power, wealth, beauty.
Yeah, I do think that it's much less talked about, but there are like parallel male issues around
Mhm.
status that seem unreachable for a lot of men. That
Mhm.
there's like, you know, you have to be over 6 feet tall and make lots of
Mhm.
money and have all these, and it's also very uh unachievable
Mhm.
for most people. Um And yeah, I mean, I think what you're kind of like highlighting is the way that like there's like it's what I'm saying about like fighting against it like makes it
Mhm.
worse. Like this other extreme of like everybody's like blonde or something.
Mhm.
And like it's like that's really oppressive too.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it's kind of I see what you're saying as it being to an extent a byproduct of mass media. And social media really, I think it really creates this a lot of like sense of inadequacy and envy because everybody just posts the best pictures of themselves doing the funnest stuff. And it's like, that's not what they're doing 24/7. But if you're on there, it looks like everybody's out having fun, being beautiful, and
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
at home like eating Cheetos. And that's just what,
Yeah.
that's just what it does create that.
That's right. Everybody else's life is perfect and you're a failure is what it makes you feel. Yeah.
Um, but it's like I think at least to say there's a dilemma here
Yeah.
about like thinking about, and I don't have an answer,
Mhm.
but I think we do need to think about what's a way of representing gender that feels um not too rigid, that it's, becomes
Mhm.
cruel or authoritarian or overly idealized in this unachievable way, or, but also not this dismantling it agenda, which can feel really aggressive and disturbing and violating in another way. And it's probably like, I think I'm really sick of the gender bending stuff by this point. I used to love, personally, like I used to watch John Waters movies and I
Mhm.
wasn't, I would watch, Gus Van Sant movies and stuff like that. It wasn't like, oh, I don't want to watch a movie because it's got like something, LGBT in it or it's got something gender bending. Like I didn't care. Some of them were really good. I like some. I didn't like others. That was fine.
Mhm.
But I feel so bombarded with this stuff that it's just not something I would watch like right
Mhm.
now, like for
Mhm.
for a while because I'm just kind of like sick of it.
Mhm.
And I feel like there's something like preachy and aggressive and intrusive and maybe deliberately violating that's a part of so much of it. So I don't know how we get back to some sort of more homeostasis.
Mhm.
Um,
No, I agree with you, and I think that there's something about it that it feels manipulative. Preachy is a really good word. It's similar to, we were talking about how all the commercials in either have Black people represented or have mixed race couples, and instead of it
right,
just seeming like, oh, there's another person because it's just kind of happening naturally, it
right,
feels like you can't see a commercial without it somehow sending you an activist message about how you're supposed to engage with race. And it's the same with the gender thing. It feels like I used to think something that I actually really liked was hearing a cover of a song that you knew was originally by a male singer, hearing it in a female
uh,
voice. I
right.
liked that. I thought that was really like refreshing and cool. And and vice versa as well. And now when I hear those kinds of things, I feel like I'm being uh, intentionally led in a certain direction. Something is being fed to me. So it's
Yeah, I
like we
remember.
start to react.
There was a Talking Heads song, "Girlfriend Is Better" from
Mm.
Speaking in Tongues, and I like the Talking Heads, and somebody did a cover of it, and it was a woman, and it became very clear to me that the song was being repurposed to be like, I'm a lesbian and I have a girlfriend, and what do you think about that?
Yeah,
And it was just kind of like, even if the song's well done, it just kind of was like, fuck off. I do not want more of this.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like I like this. I like the Talking Heads song but it's like there's something that's like that's your artistic contribution, is to kind of like, you know, I don't know, make this, you're making a point, and it just was alienating. And
Yeah.
so much of what happens in art, film, music, it's all it's that same stuff, literature. It's like instead of focusing on making good art, it'll just lean really hard on making some kind of shallow identity
hmm
politics point that
hmm
just irks me at this point.
It becomes propaganda instead of
Yeah,
art. Yeah, absolutely.
totally.
I really appreciate this conversation being kind of open, and, you know, like you said, you don't have the answer for it. You don't know the solution. How do we work on this? But I think one of the things that occurs to me is that, as you said, a lot of these things are hard to talk about. They're really hard for people to talk about. It's you're going to step on toes any which way you go when you start talking about relationships that we have to gender, to sexuality, to sex. And it's really tricky to engage in these conversations. And so I think that having the opportunity to just talk about it from a nuanced perspective that is curious and open is really refreshing. And it's probably the direction that we need to go if we want to puzzle our way to something that's working a little bit better culturally.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of power just in being able to like name a dynamic and
Mm-hmm.
be able to formulate and describe, oh, I know what I'm being bombarded with here,
Mm-hmm.
and I know what it means, and what and just being able to identify some of these things is helpful at kind of like, at least it's not quite as violating because you can kind of defend against it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell one other quick example of this because this was recent. It was on Disney Plus, and it was a documentary about octopuses. And I remember I watched the first episode and then I stopped, but it was like following one particular female octopus through the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they narrated it was like, you know, I'm probably getting some of this wrong, but it makes the same point. It's you know, she's a strong female octopus. And she doesn't need a male octopus around
Oh.
to defend from predators on her own. She can like lay her eggs and like defend predators and get food without a male octopus because she's like a strong woman. And it's like, give me a freaking break.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, but it's like that's how pervasive it is where you go to watch about octopuses. Or I remember watching a documentary years ago that was about math, that I thought it was just like a history of math or something. But they made this point to like highlight, like trying to get half of the mathematicians that they highlighted be female.
Mm.
And it's like, I know that's not the current state of the field. I definitely know that's historically not what the field
Mm-hmm.
was. And it's like, am I watching about math or am I watching about gender?
Right.
You know, and it's like, but it's one of those things where it's like, who says women can't do math? And it's like, I don't think women can't do math, but it's like, I know when these idioms are getting challenged, and I think most people have a sense of it too, even if they don't have
Mm-hmm.
the formulation.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. You know, it becomes not about what it's about, but about a vehicle for implementing or promoting your social agenda. And I'll give you one anecdote as well before we draw the conversation to a close. But when that you mentioned that the sort of so-called gender creative parenting, where they don't give their child, they don't tell anybody, even the child, that they're male or female. They just allow the child to, they call them they usually. People have even referred to them as babies. And
Right.
So that's a whole conversation in and of itself, perhaps. But I was in a mom's group when my youngest was small, when he was a baby, and he's 10 now. And there was a mother there who was complaining about this was actually the group where I first heard that gender was a social construct. And I studied psychology of gender back in undergrad, and I thought it was a pretty interesting topic, but I'd never heard anybody say, no, it's just a social construct. It's totally divorced from sex, until I was in
Right.
this group of other moms.
Right.
And there was a mom, and this was just an online group, so relatively anonymous, but this mother was saying she deliberately was breaking the gender norms for her son, and trying to get him to like more feminine things. She dressed him in dresses. She always dressed him, and he was a baby. He was like maybe a year old at this point, 2 years old. So she exclusively dressed him in dresses. And she actually said, "I'm disappointed by how stereotypically masculine his personality is turning out to be." She was disappointed that he was really. So the thing that seems that there's one of the differences between, this deliberate push and just an acceptance of variation is that if we had a real acceptance of gender expression, we would be just as happy with the really masculine little boy as we would with him expressing a desire to do things that were more feminine, sex typed. And we would be just as happy with the little frilly pink feminine little girl who carries a baby doll as we would be about the little girl who wants to be dirty and hold a truck.
Right. And I do think the most stigmatized gender expression would be like traditional masculinity. Is that I feel like for cis hetero men are one of the groups that does not have the freedom to really identify however they want. It's so heavily stigmatized by the left.
Yeah.
But another thing that I like about that anecdote is it shows how this stuff can impact mental health, because it's not hard to imagine that kid with that mother developing an issue around this, around sex, around identity, around relationships, around his family, because of these actions. And you can see that it could come out with an anger issue or a substance use issue or depression or anxiety, or like, so it's not that these attempts to dismantle gender will only necessarily impact sex and gender. Like, just like psychologists and psychiatrists have thought for a long time, your sexuality is related to your symptoms often, and that's less a part of the contemporary field. But in these cases, you can really see how that could be true for these people. So the potential for lots of negative effects is so big here. And I feel like it's totally off everybody's radar because they either think it's biological, it's not going to change, or they like these changes.
Yeah, and to your point about masculinity and how the cisgendered, to use that phrase, which I don't even like very much, that word, straight masculine male having they're very rigidly boxed in, and have been throughout this entire gender evolution, because it was men and boys who suffered more than girls if they were gender nonconforming in the past. So there's a really tight box around a male expression of masculine or feminine energy.
Yes, and I think that men often, this is like another episode for another time, but men look often to women to give them permission to be the male that they are. They don't look inward as much and kind of say, who am I as a man, and can I let myself be that? They often look for a type of female permission to be who they are. And there's this stifling or inhibiting of who they are that I think can be really, really damaging. Not even just to gender and sexuality, but to their ability to love, to their ability to be creative, to their ability to thrive, because they're stifling something really, really deep. And then it can come out as resentments and all this other stuff. So, and I don't like the word cisgender either, even though I used it myself, but I'll go on the record too. But yeah.
Oh, well, I would really love to have that conversation with you sometime. So I hope we can get into that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this conversation today.
Thanks, Leslie.
I think it's been great. As people listen to this, I'm sure that lots of different thoughts will come up and lots of different connections will be made. And they might have times when they're wishing that we would say something that we're not saying, or thinking of it slightly differently than the way that we've expressed it. And I really look forward to reading feedback. So if people have thoughts about this conversation, please share them in the comments. I would really enjoy going through those and learning what came up for other people as we were having this discussion.
Yeah, I'm curious too. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew.